I spoke yesterday about the sense organs and drew attention to the way they appear when, to our ordinary knowledge, we add what is gained through knowledge of supersensible worlds. Taking the lungs as an example, I showed that the moment we rise with spiritual sight into supersensible worlds, then other organs become just as much sense organs as our present ones. We come to the conclusion that our organs are in process of evolution and transformation. This is not apparent to ordinary consciousness, because we are always observing a process arrested, a process which, because we cannot survey either its earlier or its later stages, reveals only a momentary stage of its evolution. If our advance into the imaginative world, as I termed it in the book titled Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, reveals the lung in a state of transition, from being a vital organ to becoming a sense organ, we can no longer regard it in the way we do in ordinary life. We realize that what we ordinarily observe is a momentarily arrested stage in the lung's evolution. If we compare this with the arrested stage of the evolution of the eyes, we come to the conclusion that the lung reveals itself to be at a younger stage than the eye. I said yesterday that we could at least put forward as a question whether the eye, in the course of evolution, had once been a vital organ, as the lung is now. Let us remain cautious and merely say that there is at least a possibility that the relationship between lung and eye is like that of a child to a grown-up. One shows itself to be a younger entity, the other an older one. In other words, the eye in its youth could at some stage of world evolution have been a vital organ, which has now become a sense organ, while the lung, which is now a vital organ, could later become a sense organ. Yet we shall only come to know the truth by advancing further in supersensible knowledge. To do so, let us today consider the other extreme of the soul's life, the pole of the will. Yesterday it was described purely externally. Concerning the pole of the will, we can ask, how does it appear when we have attained imaginative cognition? We find that the organs belonging to the will sphere become paler. They fade away before spiritual sight. Our limbs are organs that belong more immediately to the will sphere. They grow paler. In fact, the characteristic feature when we rise to imaginative consciousness and observe the external organism is that the limbs become lost. And so does the metabolic system with which the limbs are connected. This aspect of man is simply no longer there in the intensity it was to physical sight. When we compare all that, which to higher vision fades from view, with something in the physical world, we arrive at a quite astonishing result. Let me draw some sketches of what comes about. Imagine that this man, as he appears to physical sight, drawing on the left. Now we observe him with imaginative cognition. The limbs grow paler, drawing in the center. Suppose this next sketch is of all that which becomes ever paler and fades away. What we get becomes more and more like an image of a human corpse, drawing on the right. In other words, we get an image of what man leaves behind at death, of that which is either buried or cremated. When a corpse is cremated, it ceases to be visible to physical sight, just as that part of man ceases to be visible to supersensible consciousness. But something else becomes visible. At the place where the arms fade away, something becomes visible, which a former instinctive clairvoyance saw more or less correctly. It was said that where physical man has arms, spiritual beings have wings, and that after death, so did spiritual man. However, to replace spiritual beings with a kind of symbol in the form of a winged creature, a superior bird, is a crude, ghost-like image. When cognition of higher worlds is further developed, that is when one ascends, in the way I have described, from imaginative knowledge to inspired knowledge. Then one recognizes what one is really seeing. And to depict this as wings is a distortion, but then it is not so easy to recognize the reality. However, the moment the ascent is made from imagination to inspiration, then by careful observation, one gradually realizes what takes the place of, say, the right arm and hand. Let me put it this way. You will agree that we make a lot of movements with our arms. According to materialistic critics, a dreadful lot of movement is carried out in eurythmy. People who do not understand eurythmy cannot bear it. But when you observe with inspired cognition what is done by the movements in eurythmy, you no longer see the arms and hands. All you see are their movements. All the individual movements are all there, and because they all merge into one another, they look like wings. Well, people who are not eurythmists also move their arms. In fact, most of the movements done by human beings are done with the arms. All the movements, their curves and forms, become visible. See drawing orange. Everything physical, muscles, flesh, bones, ceases to be visible, whereas all movements become visible. And it is the same with the legs. I said yesterday that the movements man makes are not confined within the body. In order to point to something useful, I spoke of chopping wood rather than of sport. When someone chops wood, he makes continuous movements. All these are also visible when one ascends from imagination to inspiration. However, man causes things to happen not only through his body. He does so also by means of thoughts, perhaps through other people. All the events that he causes to take place gradually become visible, particularly as one ascends from inspiration to intuition. In short, when we contemplate the pole of will, all that at death is placed in the grave ceases to be visible, whereas all man's deeds gradually become visible. After a person's death, what is still in existence are all the deeds he has carried out. That has further life and continues to exist. What passes through the gate of death can be said to be a birth of will. So you see, as regards the limbs, we must choose a different approach in order to find the transition from the physical aspect of man to the soul. And the same applies to the metabolic system. We have now considered from a certain aspect the nature of man's senses, and also what, so to speak, constitutes his will nature, that is, the source of his actions. To enable us to proceed further, let us return to the pole of the senses. Let us look back with imaginative and inspired consciousness and see what becomes of a sense organ, let us say the eye, and then consider it at the stage where the lung, let us say, has become an organ of perception. When the lung has become an organ of perception, we begin to see a completely different world. Even in public lectures, I have often spoken about the fact that another world becomes perceptible to the higher man, who gradually develops and frees himself from ordinary man, though the latter is still present and in control. We also begin to experience the world more rhythmically, more musically, as soon as the lung becomes sense organ. In fact, we begin to experience all that which, in my book titled Theosophy, I described partly as soul world, partly as spirit land. When the lung becomes sense organ, we experience a different environment, I mentioned yesterday that the lungs become sense organ in their etheric part. But what happens to our ordinary sense organs? Unlike the organs of the metabolic limb system, which disappear to higher vision, the sense organs do not disappear. They reveal themselves as they are at present, but in their spiritual nature. They reveal themselves as objective entities. They become, as it were, spiritual beings. They are, if I may so express it, what peoples our spirit world. One gets the strong impression that the sense organs expand into worlds. We witness, as it were, a world being built up out of our sense organs. Our soul has the experience that the world which we now witness coming into being unites itself with something else. It unites with what in ordinary life we look upon as our memories, that is, our mental pictures of past events. Here I must point to an important experience which occurs as one ascends from imaginative to inspired knowledge. The sense organs become, as it were, independent beings which take into themselves our memories. As we turn our attention to this fact, we become clearly aware of a certain aspect of our soul's nature. Take the example of the human eye, EYE. To ordinary consciousness, this organ is as I described it yesterday. When we begin to develop imaginative cognition, and then ascend to inspired cognition, the physical aspect of the eye disappears, but not the eye itself. It becomes ever more spiritual and expands to cosmic proportions. It becomes a world that unites itself with our memories. It unites with the thoughts that live in our memory. There's yellow in a diagram. Along this path, we gradually attain a specific insight into a certain area. A trivial concept of popular psychology is the idea that man perceives with his physical organs and develops his mental pictures, that is, his thoughts, from the physical percepts. And then the thoughts he has formed go somewhere. The philosophy of Herbart, in particular, attained eminence by letting thoughts disappear beneath some sort of threshold. Then, when they are remembered, they wandered up again and appeared in consciousness. This idea always reminds me of a children's game I often watched as a small boy. One runs both hands up a child's arm, tickling him while chanting, quote, "Up comes a little mouse who wants to hide in Joey's house," close quote. This suggests to the child that a mouse is running up his arm to hide in a box somewhere inside his head. Psychology is just about as clever. It also lets thoughts emerge from sense perceptions and then walk into a sort of savings box within the soul, from where they arise again when remembered. It is a trivial concept, but one that is much bandied about in psychology. The true facts become clear only when one comes to know the whole process through imaginative and inspired knowledge. What then becomes clear is the following. Things we see through our eyes are there. They are not created by the eyes. So, too, what we see through imagination and inspiration is also there. It is not created by the higher faculties. In other words, while ordinary consciousness is functioning, the higher reality is also present. It all goes on, but becomes visible only to supersensible sight. It goes on through every moment of our waking life. This reveals that whenever we perceive in ordinary consciousness, another process takes place beyond that consciousness. Another process goes on, which runs parallel to that of perception, only we do not become aware of it until we have attained higher consciousness. Let me put it this way. In ordinary life, whatever we perceive in everyday consciousness is already there. But all that which only becomes visible to imagination and inspiration is also there. A process takes place of which we know nothing in ordinary consciousness. When we learn to know it through higher cognition, we become aware that the memory pictures we have in ordinary consciousness are indeed only pictures. Their true reality becomes apparent to higher consciousness. There is no question of memory pictures wandering up again after having first gone down somewhere. When I form a mental picture of a physical object and then withdraw from it, the mental picture remains. After a while, the mental picture disappears, and because it is mere picture, it disappears completely. But our senses do something else. They carry out a process we do not see. They vitalize in our inner being a process that is living, which endows the thoughts contained in our memory with reality. This means that when we have a physical perception and form a mental picture, red, then another process, blue, takes place through which something real comes about, that is, a reality, not just a picture. And the red and the blue refer to a sketch that's here in the book on page 24. Let me read that sentence again. This means that when we have a physical perception and form a mental picture, red, then another process, blue, takes place through which something real comes about, that is, a reality, not just a picture. The picture vanishes, but when we remember then this, real memory takes the... Let me read that again. The picture vanishes, but when we remember, then this real memory takes the place of the former physical percept, and what we now perceive is the reality that was brought to life in us without our knowledge at the time of the physical perception. And this reality is the soul. If today you have physically before you a human being, and you see him again after 8 or 10 years, then nothing of what you see today will be present. You cut your nails, your skin flakes off. Externally, the physical body continually falls away. It becomes dust. After 7 to 10 years, that which today is the physical substance most deeply embedded in you will have come so far to the surface that it flakes off or is cut off as long nails. You can be certain that what is today at the center of your physical body gradually comes to the surface and falls away. But then what remains? What remains of man's whole being is solely the reality developed inwardly through the process taking place parallel to that of forming mental pictures. In 10 years' time, nothing of what you are today will exist except the memories of your experiences. Today, nothing exists of what you were 10 years ago except what your memories have made of you. You are woven out of your memories. All that is physical flakes off and disappears. Anyone with sound common sense, who thinks through and correlates what he can observe in ordinary consciousness, will acknowledge the truth of what I have brought before you, with the help of imagination and inspiration. If we would picture to ourselves how a human being develops, taking into account his soul nature, then from one aspect, and I beg you to keep in mind that we are considering everything from one pole, the pole of thought, we would depict it thus. See drawing. When we are born, a body is provided for us. White lines. This body is gradually filled with all that results from the process taking place parallel to sense perception. Yellow lines. All that which is body, white lines, gradually flakes off. We eat, we take in a variety of substances from the air. All this reaches into the process taking place when memories are formed and builds up the bodily nature ever anew, whereas that which impregnates the soul from the metabolic system is what is buried after death. The soul itself weaves its own essential being. It develops its being from those processes which, to begin with, are experienced merely as mental pictures. One can say in truth, I live in thoughts, but what I experience as thought in ordinary consciousness is only image. It is, so to speak, an attendant phenomenon to the reality which I bring into existence. Something of extraordinary significance emerges from this. It shows that what takes place within us, unknown to ordinary consciousness, is by far the most important for man's development. We look at the world. What we perceive through our various senses brings us experiences. We rejoice in what meets our eyes or ears. And all the time while we see, hear, and feel, there slips into our inner being all that which later can be called up in memory. In other words, all that constitutes my soul slips into me. That is an activity that goes on perpetually. One can never say that it is, because it is forever surging and weaving. Whoever earnestly endeavors to ascend to spiritual knowledge will have vivid experiences of all I have indicated. Whatever one has accumulated in life by way of written notes can, like any possession, be comfortably taken home. And because, in present-day life, comfort is much preferred to inner experiences of disquiet, all knowledge tends to be given a form that allows it to be written down and comfortably taken home. It is said, however, that anthroposophical lectures do not transcribe well, so one actually does not get much from what is written down about them and comfortably taken home. But you see, that is only a reflection of the experience of higher knowledge. When a university student today prepares for an examination, he is really happy when he manages to store up some facts in his head. And when, after 3 or 4 weeks, the time comes for the examination, he hopes to be able to pour it all out unchanged as he crammed it in. One cannot set about acquiring higher knowledge in that way. Those who really develop higher knowledge are faced with spiritual perceptions that have a life of their own. Higher knowledge is perpetually alive. It will not permit itself to be so conveniently stored in notebooks as do the rigid concepts which today are kept as scientific records of the external world. These, though radically expressed, are real inner facts. Take the case of someone who has attained supersensible cognition to a fairly high degree. Let us say he has at present certain spiritual perceptions. He can attain those experiences again later by means I have often described. He may experience them after 3 or 4 years. They have, meanwhile, gone through a life of their own. If he once more builds them up, they burden his soul with uncertainty. One gradually learns that this is nothing exceptional. Supersensible knowledge in general fills one with uncertainty when it develops further, when, as it were, it grows old. One has to attain certainty about it all over again. One experiences uncertainty already the following day, even about the loftiest spiritual perceptions, and must struggle to attain the knowledge once more. Only lower kinds of perceptions cease to be alive, and they become specters which reappear unchanged. The one who has them feels satisfied that he has attained some insight into a higher world. He grabs a notebook to make sure the experience is preserved. He would in fact like to have a kind of soul notebook for the purpose. Genuine spiritual perceptions act differently. They are living entities and must continually be created anew. One must go through the process repeatedly, for already the following day uncertainty arises, especially about the loftiest experiences, and one must win certainty all over again. One must relate to spiritual knowledge as one relates to the physical world, to which is reality and not image. Let me read that again. One must relate to spiritual knowledge as one relates in the physical world to what is reality and not image. A real process in the physical world is the need to eat. Not many of you would refrain from eating today because you had a good meal a week ago. You would not say that the meal of a week ago is still in you, nourishing you, so that there is no need to eat today. By contrast, the soul content arrived at via the body remains and can be recalled unchanged in many respects. That is not the case with a spiritual soul content. This does not just fade, its very certainty is repeatedly shaken and must be regained ever again. One effect of this aspect of attaining supersensible cognition is that the world is, as it were, illumined by it. It is like coming into a brightly lit cosmic hall. After 8 days, one has the following experience. A certain residue of memory lingers due to the fact that in attaining this higher knowledge, one drew near its reality, and this had an effect even on one's physical being. But concerning the supersensible perceptions as such, one has the experience that one continuously meets them in a dark room where one must rekindle the light ever again. This is an indication of how supersensible knowledge is experienced in the human soul. When supersensible perceptions are attained, then, unlike the instinctive clairvoyant, one cannot claim that they remain like specters. The spiritual realm that is attained must be conquered anew. Yet, though the experiences do not stay in ordinary memory, the effect naturally does. The effect is felt after a time, particularly if the supersensible knowledge has to be faced again in the form of a written manuscript or even, dreadful thought, in print. The spiritual investigator may have before him a new edition of a book he has written. He is faced with the external effect of his earlier experiences. I can imagine there are lecturers who experience deep inner satisfaction when they have before them the result of the golden words they have spun together, especially if, again and again, new editions are produced based on those same golden words. It is a very pleasurable feeling. But the written results, originating from spiritual perceptions, do not provide pleasurable feelings. They cause pain. What has become preserved and poured out into the physical world is a source of pain. That is the other side of the coin. This pain is not only like going with one's spiritual perceptions into a dark room where one must kindle the light ever anew. It is like going into a room where arrows are hurled at one from all sides, and armor must be created against what one meets as a residue, as an embodied remnant of supersensible worlds. This is an indication of how soul life is experienced when one has reached higher knowledge. In ordinary consciousness, one does not experience the soul's life directly. It is adjusted to the physical body and experienced through it. To experience the soul directly is different. The soul is continuously becoming. It is in a state of transformation and metamorphosis. This fact escapes one unless during supersensible experience one enters into the process and identifies with it. Yet to do so is felt to be unbearable. It causes pain because it is bound up with the past. Whenever a spiritual experience is not of the present, it causes pain, and one must be armed against this pain. So you see, if the living content of higher knowledge has really been absorbed, it is not so easy to live with as that to which our students listen in the universities. That knowledge only hurts when it has been forgotten and the students do badly in examinations, although that kind of knowledge does not in itself cause pain, but pleasure, for when the students possess it, they rejoice. The knowledge may pain them later if they come to see that there is something better than their own knowledge, which has become like fixed ideas in them. When the supersensible is entered into deeply, one experiences it as through and through alive. One learns how to attain and how to endure it. In the knowledge itself, one finds joy and satisfaction, and also pain. One also learns at last to know the soul directly in its reality. In ordinary daily life, the soul has fallen so deeply into materialism that its life appears to consist merely of pale concepts. Into these pale concepts warmth of feeling must be poured to rescue the soul life from the painful, pale, cold thoughts, which are but images without life. Whereas what is attained as supersensible knowledge is alive. It is in fact the living soul. And this living soul content gives us the first real concept of what we are. For our memory pictures are but faint reflections of the reality. If we manage to penetrate the curtain of memories, we arrive at that which I have just described as joyful, satisfying, light-filled, and also painful experiences of the world. In its participation in this, our soul is united with a knowledge which itself contains soul life. The past we experience as pain, but we become aware that what we experience as happiness and delight goes with us through the portal of death. It is the future. There must flow into ordinary powers of comprehension a reflection, but a living one, of what I have been saying. If mankind's past evolution is contemplated merely in the light of the frigid ideas of history, it remains just image, an image which has significance only as long as it remains in our head. Just as the mental pictures we form of sense perceptions have significance only as long as we have them in our heads, so, too, the mental pictures of history formed purely intellectually have significance only for the head. What in popular terms is called the spirit of the times is, in fact, the historian's own spirit, held up to reflect the times. One only learns real history when one participates with living knowledge in the reality of world evolution and mankind's evolution, when one feels the greatest intensity of pleasure and pain in the events taking place in the world. This means, for example, to turn the eye of the soul backward in time to, let us say, ancient Persia, India, or Greece, or any other past age. When, for instance, one feels how differently the Greeks experienced their tragedies from the way modern man experiences a theater performance. Goethe pointed to the fundamental difference between Greek tragedies and modern dramas when he said that a modern drama is a shadowy affair, whereas a Greek tragedy was a world-shaking event. And certainly those who experienced a Greek tragedy were affected by it very differently from the way modern man is affected. The latter goes to the theater to be amused and lets the play flow over him indifferently. When a Greek watched a tragedy, he felt shaken through and through. He felt shattered right down into his bodily nature. The basic issues he saw portrayed sent a chill down his spine. The Greeks also experienced life as full of sin and guilt and therefore full of sickness. They felt the tragedy as a healing force. They felt that a remedy was needed and that the public performances repeatedly raised life out of its state of guilt and sickness to what it truly ought to be. Thus the Greek tragedy was not something that merely provided amusement. It constituted a power that acted as healing for what in social life continuously fell into sickness. What effect has modern drama on present-day society? Its effect might be compared with that of having one's hair shampooed by the hairdresser, whereas the effect of a Greek tragedy must be compared with one's soul and body being healed by a truly competent physician, who with genuine health-giving medicine dynamically vitalizes the organism through and through. When one approaches history, identifying oneself completely with every situation, such as the one of a Greek watching a tragedy, then history is indeed experienced very differently from the usual way where there is no participation. In the present-day world, there is also social sickness, but no remedy is sought as was done in ancient Greece. If one really transfers one's soul into the Greek age in the anthroposophical sense, then, if I may express myself somewhat trivially, one at last catches hold of the soul element, which nowadays is otherwise suppressed in ordinary consciousness. In contemplating the world, one discovers the soul. This is what I wanted to describe to you in order to demonstrate that if the soul is to be known in its reality, one must first find where it is hidden. The images produced in ordinary consciousness tell one nothing of the soul. However, these images are what psychologists describe as soul. If one opens a book on modern psychology, one finds the first chapter dealing with mental pictures, but described in the way they appear in ordinary consciousness. What psychologists describe is that which at every moment dissolves. See drawing red, page 24. Nothing is said about the parallel process taking place beneath it. This approach of modern psychology could be compared with a conference in which, instead of the chief speakers being present, only their portraits were there. The portraits would have the same relation to the living reality they depict as man's mental life has to reality in ordinary consciousness. Psychologists are dealing with nothing but pictures. What matters is the reality behind them. I have been at pains to show you the reality that lies behind mental pictures. One cannot reach the soul through ordinary consciousness. It must first be drawn up from hidden depths. That must be kept in mind. To do so is very important when one speaks about the human soul in relation to world evolution. As the soul's true being is attained, so one gradually enters into world evolution. In these first 2 lectures, I have attempted to show how through spiritual knowledge one can reach the soul. Now that a foundation has been laid, we shall consider in the further lectures human soul life and its connection with world evolution in a more accessible form. In order to extend our considerations and link on to what was said last week, let us bring to mind some of the things already known to us. When we consider man as he lives between birth and death, we see his life divided into sections which can be studied from various aspects. Attention has often been drawn to the alternating states of waking and sleeping, and we know that dreaming is a state between these two. Thus we have 3 states of consciousness in ordinary life: waking, dreaming, and sleeping. Human nature itself can be divided correspondingly. When we trace the content of ordinary consciousness, we experience thinking, that is, forming mental pictures. I have often pointed out that only in this state, or to the extent that we are in this state, are we really awake. Anyone who observes himself without prejudice will acknowledge that feeling presents a much duller state of consciousness than thinking. Feelings surge through the soul, and unlike mental pictures, we cannot relate them so definitely, either to something in the external world or to something remembered. And we are conscious, or at least could become conscious, that as soon as we are awake, feelings come and go, very much the way dreams come and go, in the intermediate state between waking and sleeping. Anyone who has a sense for comparing different states of consciousness must say to himself, dreams have a pictorial quality. Feelings are more like indefinite forces surging within us. But apart from their content, dreams come and go just as feelings come and go. Furthermore, dreams emerge from a general darkness and dullness of consciousness, just as feelings emerge and again submerge within a general inner existence. When we consider the will, we find that what takes place within us when we have a will impulse remains as unknown to us as that which we sleep through. The only aspect that is clear in a will impulse is the thought that initiated it. What next comes into consciousness is the movement of our limbs, or the event taking place in the external world through our will. But what takes place in the legs when walking, or in the arms when we lift them, remains as unconscious as that which takes place between falling asleep and waking. So we can say that while we are awake, we experience all three conditions of waking, dreaming, and sleeping. However, we shall only arrive at a comprehensive knowledge of man if we use discernment when comparing what is given us on the one hand as sleeping, dreaming, and waking, and on the other as willing, feeling, and thinking. Let us consider sleeping man on the one hand, and on the other man engaged in an act of will. The characteristic feature of sleeping man is that the very factor that makes us human, the experience of the I, or ego, is absent. This situation is usually described by saying that the I, between falling asleep and waking up, is outside of what is present before us as physical man. Let us now compare dreaming man with man experiencing feelings. By means of ordinary self-observation, recognize that dream pictures come before the soul in a, so to speak, neutral fashion. When we dream either on waking or falling asleep, we cannot really say the pictures come before the soul like a tapestry. Rather do they surge and weave within the soul. Thus, what then takes place in the soul differs from what occurs when fully awake. When awake, we know that we take hold of the pictures which we then have. We grasp them in our inner being. They are not so nebulous and indefinite as dreams. Let me illustrate what has just been described, left-hand drawing. Let us imagine man schematically, white lines, and draw what we imagine to be weaving dreams, red lines. One must imagine the red part as a tissue of dreams experienced by the soul, which continually withdraws and again approaches the soul. The moment he wakes up, man does not experience such a tissue of weaving pictures. He now has the pictures of whatever he is experiencing firmly within him. Right-hand drawing. The weaving pictures, which were formerly outside, are now within him. He lays hold of them with his body, and because he does so, they are no longer undefined weaving pictures, but something which he controls inwardly. When man is fully awake, then, what weaves and hovers as dreams become thoughts within him. He is then in control of what now lives in his soul as mental pictures. In this relationship, you can see that the soul is taking hold of something which from outside draws into man. What has just been described is in fact the entry of what we call the astral body into man's inner being. To ordinary consciousness, it is that which, before entry, weaves and hovers as dreams. The astral body is, therefore, within us when, after waking, we begin to think. We then form mental pictures, and we know that we do so, for these mental pictures are under our control. As long as they are dreams, they hover outside. You need only imagine a kind of cloud that hovers near you in which dreams are weaving. You then draw in this cloud. You now control it from within. Because it is no longer outside, you cease to dream. Just as you grasp objects with your hands, so do you grasp dreams with your inner being, which means that you have drawn in the astral body. We must ask, what precisely is it that we now have within us? We can perhaps find a point of reference by looking at certain dreams which are not just pictures, but begin also to become indefinite feelings. Just think how often dreams can be quite unpleasant. Many dreams are connected with anxiety. You wake up feeling anxious. In this undefined state of anxiety, less often it may be a state of joy, you have the first glimmer of something which, as it further develops, becomes fully present as you wake up. What is it that glimmers forth when a dream causes, for example, anxiety? Such dreams are interwoven with feelings. Anxiety is a feeling. The feeling is undefined because the dream is still partly outside the organism, yet it is far enough within to intermingle with feeling. It interweaves with what already lives in the soul as feeling. Only when the astral body has entered completely do you have definite feelings. These are conditioned by the physical organization and can now be penetrated by mental pictures present in the astral body. When we consider certain nightmares and anxiety dreams in the right light, we draw near to what actually takes place when the astral body enters man's physical body. You will always find that it is some disorder in the breathing which causes the state of anxiety of some dreams. From this you can see clearly that the astral body draws in and again draws out through the breath. It is really possible to observe these things, if only the observation is thorough enough and free from prejudice. Something can be seen here that enables us to recognize that what weaves in dreams is in fact the astral body, and that it draws into our organism by taking hold of the breath as we wake up. This leads to the recognition of something else that is not normally taken into account but is of great significance. The human being is usually regarded as if he were simply a physical organism, a body built up of solid matter. That is just not true. The least part of the human being is solid, less than 10%. For the rest, it is a water organism, an organism of liquid, so that in reality we must think of this organism built up in such a way that 1/10 is solid, see drawing white lines, and the solid saturated with water, blue lines. You only represent the human organism truly when you see it as a column of liquid in which the solid is deposited. However, there is more to it. We must also picture the human organism as an organism of air. The air is outside, we breathe it in. A part of the outside air is now within us, and we breathe it out again. So we are also an air organism. Let us draw that too, red lines. It is just this air organism which is taken hold of by the astral body as we wake up. We breathe in the air. It goes through transformations, the effect of which pours through the whole organism. The oxygen takes up the carbon and transforms it into carbonic acid. Thus an air process continually takes place within us. As we wake up, the air process is permeated by the astral body. The movement of the astral body follows the same path as the air through the organism. The air process consists solely of air when we sleep. When we are awake, then the movements of the astral body, as it were, swim along within what lives in us as air processes. But now depict to yourselves the following. The astral body draws into that which I have schematically drawn in red and carries out its movements, in fact carries out its general activity within the air organism. This all takes place within the watery organism, which is represented in the blue lines. When we are awake, these air processes are in reality processes of the astral body. and they continually push against the watery organism. Man's etheric body is within the watery organism, both night and day. So you have simultaneously a reciprocal effect between the etheric body and the astral body, as well as between their physical counterparts, which are the air processes and the water processes. Thus you can visualize these processes running their course within man between his breathing and the movements of all the bodily fluids. Yet that is again merely a copy of what takes place between the astral and etheric bodies. The whole organism, consisting of solid, fluid, and air, is also permeated with warmth. See drawing yellow lines, page 38. The whole organism has its own warmth, that is, its own warmth ether. On the gaseous waves moves astrality, and in the warmth flowing through the body moves the actual I, or ego, of man. So you have the physical body as such, then the fluid body, which is also physical but differentiated from the solid physical body. The fluid physical body has an intimate connection with the etheric body. Then the gaseous organism, which has an intimate connection with the astral body, and finally all the warmth processes, that is, the warmth ether in man, which has an intimate connection with the human eye. Thus, one can say that in the various physical constituents of man, we have a picture of the whole man. The solid part, so to speak, exists by itself. The fluid within the organism cannot exist by itself. Within the head we have very little solid, and what there is swims in the cerebral fluid. Within this fluid is the etheric part of the head. In the breathing process, the following takes place. As we breathe in, the breath pushes inward up through the spinal fluid toward the brain. In our waking state, the astral also moves along this thrusting movement toward the etheric part of the head. We have then, on the one hand, an interaction of the movement of the cerebral fluid with the movement of the breath, and on the other, an interaction of the etheric part of the head, of which what takes place in the cerebral fluid is only an image, with the breathing process, which is again only an image of the astrality in man. We also have a continuous interplay of warmth. The movement of the blood mediates the warmth. On the waves of this sea of warmth, our eye also moves. To become clear about these interactions within man's bodily nature, it is essential that we represent them vividly to ourselves. Only the solid organism can be observed by itself. The fluid organism does not have the possibility of moving in waves the way water moves in the external world. The play of movement in the fluid organism is an image of what takes place in the etheric body. Again, what takes place in the delicate processes of breathing is an image of what takes place in man's astral body. Keeping this in mind, let us once more look at the cerebral fluid. Within it certain movements take place, copying movements of the etheric body. Man acquires the etheric body when he descends from spiritual worlds into the physical world. Within the spiritual world he does not yet possess it. But as man takes hold of his physical body, he also takes possession of his etheric body. He, as it were, draws out the ether from the cosmos. He can unite with the physical body, which he receives through heredity, only when he has drawn the ether from the cosmos. So that all that lives in the etheric body of man we bring with us when we take hold of the physical body. The human embryo develops within the maternal body. Let us consider the fluid within the embryo. In general physiology, only the solid components, or what appear to be solid components, are examined, not the fluid. Were this to be investigated, it would be found that the cerebral fluid in particular, contains an image of all that which was present already in the ether body, as the ether was drawn together and which then slips into physical man. If this is the physical body, see drawing, in which the physical human embryo develops, I do not draw the solid, only the fluid embryo, red lines. Then what as astral and I is present descends from the spiritual world. What has been drawn together from the ether slips in, yellow lines. In fact, as he dives down into his physical body, the fluid part of the organism absorbs what man brings with him. Therefore, if the movements within the cerebral fluid of the child were to be investigated, they would be found to be like a photograph of what the human being has been before he united with the physical body. You see, it is very significant to realize that a photograph is to be found in the cerebral fluid, that is to say, in the movements of the cerebral fluid, of what has taken place before conception. It is fairly easy to understand that a kind of photograph of what existed before conception is to be found in the cerebral fluid. But let us now consider the process of breathing. Breathing appears to be an out-and-out physical process because of the way our lungs function. Air is drawn in, and under the influence of the external world, the breathing takes place even when we are asleep. That is, even when the eternal part of our being is not united with the temporal part. Our breathing is not affected by whether we are awake or asleep. When we sleep, the wave movements of the breath go through the organism. When we are awake, they in addition carry the astral body. In other words, they are able to carry the astral body, but it is not incumbent on them to do so, for when we are asleep, they do not. What follows from this? It follows that the reason the cerebral fluid can carry on by itself is because it is isolated within man's inner being. It constitutes a kind of continuation of what existed before. On the other hand, nothing of what existed before can be continued in this intimate way within our breath. When we consider the human head, we find within the cerebral fluid, that is, within the physical body itself, the actual continuation of pre-natal spiritual man. Whereas when we consider the organization of the chest and the process of breathing, we find a different situation. The physical breath takes place by itself. See drawing, yellow lines. The spiritual is less strongly connected with the physical process, red lines. Therefore, one must say that in the head, spiritual man, the man of soul and spirit, is closely connected with physical man. They have become a unity. In the chest, that is not the case. There, the two are more apart. The physical organism is more by itself, and so too the soul spiritual. Let us now compare this with the state of dreaming. When we dream, the I and astral body are outside. They are separated from the sleeping body. However, for the chest man, that is to some extent always the case. The chest man, that is the man of breath and heart, in short, rhythmic man, is the organism for feeling. Feelings run their course like dreams, because the soul spiritual is not so firmly connected with the physical organism, is not so completely within physical man. So you see, if one wants to consider the whole man, one must take into account these different interactions of what pertains to the soul and what pertains to the body. In our materialistic age, the human being is considered only in the most external way. This is evident from the way modern science looks upon man, as if he were nothing but a solid organism within which the soul is somehow active. On this basis, it is impossible to visualize how, for example, an impulse of will, experienced purely within the soul, can lead to the lifting of the arms or legs. In fact, from the point of view of what we experience as the soul's part in an act of will, the human organism, as conceived by modern anatomy and physiology, is like a piece of wood, and as alien to the soul as a piece of wood. What in physiology today is described as human legs is like a description of two pieces of wood. They are related to the soul as if they were wooden legs. As little as the soul could have any relationship with two pieces of wood lying about, just as little could it have any relationship with legs as described by modern physiology. However, human legs are penetrated by liquid. Here we already come upon something in which it is easier to understand that the spiritual can be active within it. Yet it is still difficult. Once we have come to the gaseous, the airy element, then we are in a physical material so fine that it is much easier to visualize the soul element to be within it, and easier still when we come to warmth. Just think how close a connection can come about between the warmth of the physical organism and the soul. You may at some time have had a terrible fright and grown quite hot. There you have an inner experience of the connection between the soul and the warmth in the physical organism. In fact, when we examine the solid, fluid, gaseous, and warmth components of the whole organism, we gradually arrive at the soul. It can be said that the eye takes hold of the inner warmth, the astral body of the gaseous, the ether body of the fluid, and only the solid remains untouched. In the solid nothing enters. Picture to yourselves the way the human organism functions. You have the human brain, see drawing, page 46, that has fluid in it, and also solid parts, into which, as I said, the soul does not enter. The solid parts are, in reality, salt deposits. Whatever solid we have within us is always salt-like deposit. Our bones consist solely of such deposits. In the brain, very fine deposits continually occur and again dissolve. There is always a tendency in our brain to bone formation. The brain has a tendency to become quite bony. But it does not become bony because something is in movement and is continually dissolved. When we examine the organism, especially the brain, we first find within it a condition of warmth, and within the warmth, the air, which is the bearer of the astral body, and is continually playing into the cerebral fluid while being breathed in and out. We then have the cerebral fluid, in which the ether body lives. Then we come to the solid, into which the soul cannot enter because it consists of deposited salt. Because of this salt formation, which is less than 10% of the total organism, we have within us something into which the soul cannot enter. As human beings, we have an organism. Within this organism there are warmth, gaseous, and fluid elements, all of which the soul can penetrate. This is comparable to having objects on which light falls but cannot penetrate and is therefore thrown back. Let us say we have a mirror. Light cannot go through it and is therefore reflected. Similarly, the soul cannot penetrate the solid, salt organism and is therefore continually reflected. If this were not the case, there would be no consciousness at all. Your consciousness consists of soul experiences reflected from the salt organism. You are not aware of the soul life as it is absorbed by the warmth, gaseous, and fluid organism. You experience it only because the soul life within the warmth, gaseous, and fluid is reflected everywhere by salt, just as sunbeams are reflected by a mirror. The outcome of this reflection is our mental pictures. When someone deposits too much salt, salt always takes on forms, then he produces a lot of mental pictures. He becomes rich in thoughts. If too little salt is secreted, the thoughts have vague outlines like reflections from a faulty mirror. Or, said differently, when too much salt is secreted, thoughts predominate and become very precise, and he who has them becomes pedantic. He is convinced of the rightness of his thoughts because they arise from so much solid. He becomes materialistic. When too little salt is secreted, or perhaps too much in the rest of the organism but too little in the head, then the thoughts become indefinite, and the person becomes fanciful, or perhaps he becomes a mystic. Our soul life is dependent on the material processes taking place within us. It may be necessary, when someone is too prone to fanciful ideas, to administer some remedy that will enable him to deposit more salt, or else give better form to the salt he does deposit. He will then escape from his fantasies. However, one should not make too great an effort to cure a human being by physical means of his fantasies or pedantry. Not much can be done anyway. To do something different is more important and can be of great value. Someone who knows how to observe human beings in regard to both soul and body will notice if there is too much sediment, whether in the head or in the organs of the rhythmic or metabolic systems. He will notice it because the whole thought configuration becomes different. The manner in which a person alters his thoughts can contribute significantly to a diagnosis. But such delicate reactions are not often noticed. For example, someone may suddenly make mistakes repeatedly when speaking. He does not normally do so, but suddenly he makes mistakes again and again. It may last a few days and then cease. He has suffered a slight ailment, and the mistakes in speaking are merely a symptom. Such instances can often be described quite exactly. For example, someone may for a few days secrete too much gastric acid. Now, what occurs? This gastric acid dissolves certain substances in the stomach, which ought to pass on beyond the stomach. This means that the organism is deprived of these substances, with the result that the person's inner mirror pictures lack the necessary sharpness. His thoughts become vague and he makes mistakes in speaking. You will have realized what must be done. One must provide a remedy that will ensure less acidity in the stomach. Then the person's thoughts will again become ordered. His digestion is now in order, and he ceases to make mistakes when speaking. Or take the example of someone who absorbs gastric acid too intensely. This can occur if the spleen is abnormally active. When this happens, the gastric acid is distributed throughout the body. The body, as it were, becomes all stomach. Such acid sediments are, in fact, the cause of many illnesses. A specific pricking pain may be felt, or, if the head is affected, a feeling of dullness. When you look at such a person with insight, it will often be found that the absorption of all the acidity has created in him a certain greediness. When someone is permeated with acidity, his eyes may lose their friendly expression. If someone is suffering from too much acidity, his eyes will reveal it. It is sometimes possible to restore his friendly expression by administering an acid that can be digested in the stomach, because it is of a kind that has no tendency to spread throughout the organism. The reason I am saying all this is to show you that the science of the spirit meant here does not simply contemplate the human soul in a nebulous way. It recognizes the soul as the ruler and builder of the body, active within it everywhere. The human organism is described nowadays as if it were solid through and through. The solid alone is taken into account. It is impossible to arrive at any conception of how the soul actually exists within the body, unless one also considers the fluid, gaseous, and warmth elements of the organism. The soul does not live in the solid part of the organism. It does not enter the solid any more than light penetrates a mirror. Light is thrown back from the mirror. The soul retreats everywhere from the salt. The peculiarity of the soul is that it is deflected from the bones. See drawing, red lines. We carry our bones within us, empty of soul. The soul is not within them, but is rayed back into the organism, The bones in the skull are really ingeniously arranged. The soul rays out in all directions and is reflected into our inner being. We do exist within the skull bones, but only as solid physical man. If we would make a comprehensive sketch of the head, we would have to depict the soul as raying out within the head. See drawing, red lines. If nothing else happened, we would be in a dull unconscious condition. However, as the soul cannot enter the bones of the skull, it is rayed back into our inner being. Arrows, short red lines. We experience the soul only when it is reflected into our inner being. So you see how matters stand. The reality is that you have the soul within you, rayed back from the mirror of the skull bones. Spiritual science does not exclude what is material. On the contrary, recognition of how the soul controls matter makes it at last comprehensible. After all, one does not come to know that someone is a baker by the fact that he makes certain movements, but from knowing that the movements he makes shape the rolls and croissants. Neither does one come to know the soul through abstract considerations, but by knowing that a reflection of the soul's activity is to be found in the physical organism. It is a question of understanding the organism rightly and recognizing that it is an image of the soul. If we cannot make the effort to understand even man's physical nature, we shall never learn to know the soul. We must have the goodwill to understand how human nature comes to expression through the physical. What is usually spoken of as soul, by those who will not approach the physical with spiritual insight, is something utterly unreal. It is as unreal as if you had a tasty meal before you, and instead of eating it, tried to eat its reflection in a mirror standing beside it. One can become knowledgeable about the soul only by observing her creative activity, and not by persisting to regard it as a mere abstraction. And one should certainly not adopt the view that to be a conscientious spiritual scientist, one must scorn the material. Rather, should the material be understood spiritually, it will then reveal itself as spirit through and through. To do otherwise is to live in intellectual abstractions, and they obscure rather than enlighten.